Hello, welcome to Masters and Volts, the Business of Politics. I'm Merrick Masters, and I'm here with my co-host, Bill Volz, to interview Professor David Dulio, who is from Oakland University and is a professor of political science, who does research and teaching in the area of political campaigns and financing, as well as elections. We're here today to ask him about his journey to this particular point in his career, and also what his views are about some of the issues in politics today, particularly the senatorial and gubernatorial races in Michigan that are upcoming in the 2026 election. I'm going to introduce David and then ask him a few questions. And I'll turn things over to my co-host at that point in time to continue the questioning. But Bill, say hello to the audience just for a second and say a little bit about yourself.
Bill Volz, professor of business law and ethics at the Mike Ilitch School of Business at Wayne State, and very much looking forward to talking to Dr. Dulio.
I should also say that I'm Professor Emeritus at Wayne State, Professor Emeritus of Business. And the Emeritus is a very honorific title, which gives me library privileges and parking privileges, and I'm very grateful for that. But a little bit about Professor Dulio. He is a distinguished professor of political science and also director of the Center for Civic Engagement at Oakland University. He teaches courses on campaigns and election, Congress, political parties, interest groups, and other areas of American politics. He's published 11 books, two of his most recent being Michigan Government Politics and Policy, and the other Campaigns from the Ground Up, a very fascinating title. He has written lots of articles and book chapters on subjects ranging from the role of professional consultants in U.S. elections to campaign finance. He is also a former American Political Science Congressional Fellow on Capitol Hill, where he worked in the U.S. House of Representatives Republican Congress for former U.S. Representative J.C. Watts from Oklahoma. And I remember his leadership in Congress very well. A very impressive person who had a very distinguished career in Congress. Welcome, David. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be with you and on your great podcast. I look forward to the conversation.
We'd like to talk to you a little bit about yourself and your journey to being a political science and what you've done in the area of research and teaching since then. So tell me, what led you to be a political scientist and to focus on the areas that you've done in elections and campaigns and Congress, et cetera?
Sure. So for me, it all goes back to a course that I took as an undergraduate. And I did not go to college thinking that I was going to be a political scientist. I didn't go to college thinking I was going to be an academic. I went thinking I was going to be a golf course architect. And I had some twists and turns in my college career, and like many students do today. But I took a class called War, Presidents, and Public Opinion, and it hooked me. And I thought it was the most interesting thing that anybody could talk about or read about, and it was just fascinating. I eventually ended up as a double major in political science and psychology, and I had the conversation with my parents that a lot of students do today. What are you going to do with a political science degree? And that's pretty common. And my answer to them was, I don't know. And I was overwhelmed, I think, by the options that are put in front of a graduate with a liberal arts degree. I think that it's an incredibly valuable, incredibly flexible program of study for anybody. But I was also fortunate to have an uncle who was a faculty member at Western Michigan for many years. And I talked to him about it and followed in his footsteps and figured it sounds like a pretty cool job. And I went to graduate school in Washington at American University. And I quickly discovered that at AU, political science meant something different than it did when I was an undergraduate. And as an undergraduate, it was a lot of theory and abstract, but at American, Political science was practical, it was applied, it was Congress and the president and campaigns. And that's the track that I followed because of some great mentors and advisors there who studied that element of political science. And it also led me to that congressional fellowship that you mentioned. When I finished my PhD, I applied to that thinking that I wanted my career to follow some of the other APSA congressional fellows, and just because I had so much respect for them and wanted to take my career in that direction. And it still pays dividends to this day when I teach a class on Congress or when I talk about it and think back to the lessons that were learned. And I got to Oakland in 2002 and have been here ever since. It's been a great place to work and study and write. I've written about a lot of different things, mainly elections, mainly or campaigns, maybe is a better way to say it. And more recently, my time has been taken up with this project called the Center for Civic Engagement, which we launched in 2018. So we're going on 7 years, and we launched it on really two pillars of work, and those two pillars were driven by, let's say, straws that broke the camel's back for me. And one was in 2016, and the realization maybe overwhelming evidence that Americans can't talk to each other anymore. And it too easily and quickly and too often devolves into, boy, you have a different opinion than I do, and therefore you're evil. And that's bad for our politics. That's bad for our culture, bad for society. So we have a goal of making Oakland University known as a convener of conversations about issues of public importance. But when we have those conversations, we want to have them in the right way. We want them to be civil and respectful and deliberative. And we've had a number of successes in that regard. We've hosted folks like Lech Walesa from Poland, the former president, Madeleine Albright, right before, actually, I think one of her actually last public appearances. We've had former governors Snyder and Blanchard appear together on stage. And just last fall, we had Karl Rove and Donna Brazil, who, as you both know, worked on different sides of a presidential election and fought it out. But you know what? They have a great relationship. They're friends. And it was a great model of civil and respectful deliberation and conversation about a pretty powerful election cycle, and one that was pretty divisive. We pride ourselves on being able to be that model. And the second one, real quick, was just the realization that civic literacy stinks. And that's in both our classrooms here on campus, but also out there in the general populace. That's a tougher battle, I think, actually. But yeah, that's the twists and turns.
It's interesting because your research is very applied oriented, I would say. You deal with campaign consultants, which is very important. You also deal with the issue of campaign financing. I've done a little bit of work myself on campaign financing, and I've never quite figured out how to write a law that would put a lid on financing campaigns. And it seems that interest groups always find a way of working around it. There's a lot of creative lawyering that goes on in this. And I think law schools encourage that. But I was going to say, tell us a little bit about what you do in terms of the research. And I noticed that in American University, I believe that they have a campaign group there that they actually train people to do campaigns at American University, I think. Is that true?
That's correct. Yeah, that is correct. It's called the Campaign Management Institute. It's part of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, which is where my mentor and main advisor worked at AU. I studied under Jim Thurber, who had a very similar, he brought me into the profession in a way that's a lot different than a lot of political scientists, probably most political scientists. And Candy Nelson also she's getting ready to retire, but the Campaign Management Institute, and it's a really unique model. There are other places around the country. George Washington there in Washington has a campaign management track that they have in their graduate program. It's called the Graduate School of Political Management. Akron University and the Ray C. Bliss Institute there have an applied politics program. Suffolk University has a campaign management course. We have one here at OU, but all of those are semester-long programs. And the thing that makes the program at American unique is that it's done in a 2-week intensive program. And they offer it twice a year, once as an intersession course between the fall and spring semesters. So right after New Year's, you're in the classroom for 2 weeks and it's all you do. And then once again in between the spring and summer semesters for 2 weeks. But it's quite something. I did it in 1995. And again, I still remember elements of it because it was so intense. And you're in the classroom for 7, 8 hours a day. And then you're working on your campaign plan that you're writing after that. And never fails, at least in the sessions that I saw, first as a student and then as a graduate assistant there, you're up for 2 or 3 days putting the finishing touches because there are no extensions in that course. There are no, they treat the presentation, that's election day. And as you both know, right, there's no extension on election day.
Yeah, they don't move it because I didn't have time to get to that yet.
It's coming whether you're ready or not. It just puts you in such a different mentality of trying to finish work with this looming deadline. And it really teaches great lessons. And a huge part of that course was hearing from and learning from practitioners who are in the middle of it and who have active clients for U.S. House races, U.S. Senate races, gubernatorial races, right? It was a really great way to have some exposure to that world.
If there were a single work or a set of works that would give the audience an idea of what you have studied most, what would you point to? You don't have to mention one article or one book.
No, that's a great question. I think it depends on what time frame we're talking about. But
I'll let you handle that anyway.
Yeah, most recently, I think, and as you both know, the state of Michigan and our politics has gotten so much attention in the last 8 years, right? Beginning in the 2016 campaign when Donald Trump appears on the scene and then surprises everybody by winning the presidency. People looked at states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania and said, what's going on here? I thought there was this blue wall. And that blue wall crumbled in 2016, it was rebuilt to some extent in 2020, and then crashed again in 2024. I've written a lot about Michigan politics from a campaign perspective in the last 6 or 7 years, and there are a few books out there that I've contributed chapters to. There's a series called Presidential Swing States that's really good. They've got a couple chapters on Michigan. Another one, Party. I can't remember the title of it, but I did one with a colleague who's also emeritus at this point. And hey, don't undersell those library privileges or parking privileges.
No, I'm not. I mentioned those because of work.
or keeping your email address, right? That's
That's another.
A colleague who's emeritus now, John Klemansky, we wrote about populist and the arguments that Trump made here in 2016 that had that populist feel to it, and talked about, we examined how well that message worked in particular areas in Michigan. And of course, we can't talk about that without referencing Macomb County and the Reagan Democrats that Stan Greenfield made famous in the 1980s after Ronald Reagan came here and campaigned very effectively with blue collar workers, auto workers in Macomb County, and Trump really recreated that success. So we've written a lot about that and how that's continuing to evolve. It's just a fascinating element of not only our state's politics, I think, but American politics generally. I think that Michigan in a lot of ways is a microcosm of the country, and in terms of geography and in shifting political preferences among important groups and just a bunch of different ways that I think is just really interesting.
That's a perfect point to segue into Bill's question. So thank you, David. I'll turn things over to Bill.
Yeah, sure.
You've given us a hint of a wide range of rich areas of study in elections. Is there an area in You talked about shifting political allegiances. Is there an area of elections that you're finding most interesting now? Maybe it may be better to articulate. Is there an area of campaigning that you're finding most interesting right now?
I think, Bill, that I'll answer that in two ways. I do think that from a vote getting perspective, or party coalition perspective, I think the argument that we're in a realignment period is an interesting one. I think that there is interesting contrary evidence that we're in a de-alignment period where people are pulling away from the party label. And there's no better evidence of that than the large increasing percentage of Americans who claim to be independents rather than partisans. But as you both know, party ID is still the most important, most, let's say, best predictor of vote choice. People have, even though they come out and say that they're an independent, they have some underlying partisanship, and most of the time they're willing to say that they have it. But seeing how party coalitions change over time, I think now is really interesting. And whether it's occupational or blue collar, white collar, there's certainly an educational component to that. And that might be one of the biggest drivers of it. A colleague, political science colleague at Michigan State, Matt Grossman, has written a really great book about that. He'd be a good one to have on your show. So there's clearly something happening, but does it have staying power? I think is the key question, because a lot of this was driven by Trump and his messaging, his communication to those blue collar workers in Macomb County and other parts of Michigan that are heavily reliant on trade and manufacturing as their part of their economies. So I think the big question is, how much staying power does it have? And because at some point Trump is not going to be on the ballot or part of our conversation. And I think there's evidence that a lot of those folks who are Trump voters aren't interested in other Republicans, that they're going to vote for Trump, but nobody else. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Republicans try to, when we get there, operate in a post-Trump. The other element I think that's really interesting from a pure campaigning standpoint is how campaigners are dealing with, I'll give you two. Number one, the polling industry, I think, is just fascinating, and how they're able to tap into get their samples right. Because I think that's been a big reason behind the misses that we've seen. And pollsters still haven't figured out how to sample Trump voters. That's why in this last election cycle, again, Trump was underestimated in the polling versus results on election day. But the communications piece, there's, as you both know, right, all this just information saturation, and how campaigns are able to communicate messages that cut through the clutter and that can have an impact on the person that receives that message, and either in terms of persuasion or mobilization, I think is really interesting.
I've heard your, I think, very sophisticated presentations on polling and how many young African American men have really been tested and was very enlightening to me. And you're right, that you might like Reagan, you might like Trump, but it doesn't necessarily transfer to Mitt Romney.
I'm glad you brought that up, Bill, because I think that while folks in Macomb County and other places like that, right? It's just not Macomb, but that's the home of the Reagan Democrats. But the key, I think, there is the label, right? Stan Greenberg called them Reagan Democrats for a reason. They liked Reagan, but they kept voting for other Democrats, right? For years, Democrats in other offices carried
Yeah,
Macomb County.
they did.
Now that's different. Macomb is a Republican county now. And you look at not just the top of the ticket, but down the ballot. The vast majority of uh, countywide elected officials in Macomb are Republicans. Mark Hackle is not your typical Democrat. The sheriff, Tony Wickersham, not your typical. Plus, it's a sheriff, right? There's only so much leeway that partisans have in a sheriff's role. And to that point, Oakland County, right next door, is now
The other way.
it's a Democratic county, which gets to the shifts in demographics across for the coalitions, as well as just how things can change over time, and in many ways mirror what's happening in the country. So I think that's fascinating.
Said, I think the red states went red and the blue states went blue. Speaking to, where do you think, I'm going to ask you to dive into that shifting, I don't want to say morass, but it may be shifting, but it sure seems intense. It's not a wavering sense. Where do you think Michigan is in this ideological smorgasbord? That's the wrong metaphor, but in this whirlpool, this very changing mix, where's it going? You spoke to education. I think that's a very powerful predictor. Where are we? Where are we headed?
I'll give you a very unsatisfying answer. And I find that in politics and political science these days, it's probably many ways the best answer to a lot of questions. And that is, it depends. I think one of my big takeaways from 2024, and certainly relative to 20 and 16 as well, Michigan is a place where small shifts among specific populations can have a huge impact on outcomes. And if we just think about the last cycle, you can see that in a number of different ways where turnout increases or decreases in one demographic group, small shifts toward one candidate or away or toward the other candidate can really change outcomes. So Trump wins here in 2024 by about 80,000 votes, right? We see small but important shifts toward Trump in Hispanic Americans, African American men, and some strengthening among female voters. Not to mention the Arab American population. And here in Michigan, that didn't deliver the state for Trump. But, you look at Dearborn Heights and Hamtramck, those are places that Joe Biden won in 2020 with 70-30 or 80-20. In 24, in two of those communities, Trump carries a plurality of votes. He gets 46 or 47%. And Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, gets another 18 or 15%, right? So there's that, if there's any sort of fleeting shift, that's probably the one to keep an eye on the most, right? Because there was so solidly in the Democratic camp that there's such a big change, I think, driven by a couple of different factors. Number one, the uncommitted movement and the opposition to the Biden policy in the Middle East from October 7, 2023 through Election Day. I think that had a big impact. But also, there were two mayors in those communities that endorsed Trump. And I had the opportunity, good fortune to be with some folks who came from countries like the UK and South Africa, Australia. They came at the end of October because Americans at that point had been sick and tired of it. But these folks traveled to the US so that they could witness the US presidential election. And they spent some time in Michigan. And I got to take them around to a few places. And one of the places we went was a We went to a grocery store and a travel agency in Hamtramck. And to hear the owner of the grocery store and owner of the travel agency say, I'm all in for Trump in part because our mayor endorsed him and we trust our mayor and he's been doing a great job. So we're going with that. Can Trump, or I should say, can Republicans duplicate that coalition that Trump put together? I'm skeptical. I think, but at the same time, the next big election, 2026, the voter turnout is always lower in those midterms. Maybe they don't need all of those voters. Where can they cobble together this winning coalition? I think that the seats that we have up in 26 are going to be just fascinating to watch the parties how the party's candidates approach the primary and then try to get that middle of the road coalition for that general election. It's going to be very interesting times in Michigan.
That's interesting. And no hint of a sweep or no hint of a foregone conclusion that it remains candidate specific and an emerging issue specific or
I think that's right, Bill. I think it's Michigan is a 50-50 state. And having said that, there can be large candidate effects, large issue effects, right? And we've seen that in the recent past. I think Republicans, if you caught them in an honest moment, would say that they didn't have the best set of candidates in 2022 or 2018 to compete against. In 22, it was that trifecta of incumbents, right? Whitmer, Nessel, and Benson. And I think in other years, the abortion issue was used incredibly effectively in 2022 by the Democrats and you combine the candidate effects with the issue effects, and that's how you get Gretchen Whitmer wins by 10 points in a state that's generally even.
very interesting. Merrick, back to you.
This is a good point to talk a little bit about your views on the upcoming 2026 elections. And I'll let you talk about both the gubernatorial and the senatorial race in whatever order you would like. But talk a little bit about who you think the candidates are and what some of the issues will be in both of those races.
Yeah, I think number one, we have to start here because I think that it's going to have a big impact. 26 is a midterm year, and history has taught us a lot about midterm elections. And that is very clearly that the party of the president usually does poorly and takes some losses at the midterm. This is likely setting up as a tough year for Republicans. I think Democrats know that, Republicans know that, and there's been, I think, a bit more of a not scramble, but more of a flurry of Democrats making their intentions known to run for one of those offices. I think more are coming, and less so on the Republican side. I think they're trying to figure it out right now, and that's going to be interesting and important to watch. Certainly, when we're talking about Democrats and the candidates, I think if Pete Buttigieg gets in that Senate race, he's going to be tough to beat. He has an incredible opportunity to raise money, and I think he'll be, like I said, I think he'll be tough to beat. But he's not without flaws. I think the short time in Michigan here could be used against him. In terms of issues, I think it's too early to tell, but economy is likely to remain at the top of the list. I think the governor's race, the big impact factor there has got to be Mike Duggan running as an independent. Never before have we seen the high numbers, high percentages of Americans who say that they are looking for an alternative to the two parties. Mike Duggan may be doing this at exactly the right time. Is this going to be easy for him? Goodness, no. It is an uphill battle to run as an independent in a big race like this. But This is also the guy that won a write-in candidacy for the mayor of Detroit. He's used to doing hard things. I think depending on how the primaries work out for the Democrats and Republicans in that race, I think Mike Duggan's got a real shot.
Let me ask you to follow up a little bit upon that. As an observer looking at the situation in Michigan, it seems to me right now that the Republican Party is in a little bit of disarray. It doesn't have it's a split party. You have the Trump faction, and then you have what the Trump supporters would call the Rhino faction. Or the country club faction, and they don't really meet well together. Or when they do meet, it's combust. But you don't see a whole lot of candidates, top-level candidates, emerging in the races for Republican as governor or U.S. Senate. Are they just going to sit this one out, or are they going to have a viable candidate? It would seem to me that even if you don't think you have a good shot at winning it, you want to build your party during this process by presenting a good candidate.
So I think that's a statement that would come from the party perspective, right? That, hey, as a party, we want a strong candidate, viable candidate to maintain and build the party. But they can't make anybody do it. They could draft somebody and encourage them to do. And this is one of the things we see in midterm elections or other years where one party feels that it's at a big advantage or disadvantage, where most of the high quality candidates in the party that's disadvantaged will say, not now, right? They're smart enough, they're strategic enough to look forward and see tough times ahead. So it would not be surprising if Republicans have some trouble getting the best group of candidates to emerge. You're seeing the opposite on the Democratic side, right? More and more Democrats are making noise about running because they see the opportunity that exists. If Pete Buttigieg, talk of Haley Stevens running for that Senate seat, that would be quite the primary. But it would be two Democrats looking at things saying, now's my chance, right? As you both know, an open Senate seat doesn't come around very often. And the opportunity to win that and grab a hold of it could be tough to pass up. The other element is maybe Republicans are going to take a page from Alyssa Slotkin's playbook and the Democratic candidates and the party in 2024 in that Senate race, where they did a great job of clearing the field for Slotkin and not having to deal with a messy Democratic primary that year. And I think that paid huge dividends. Slotkin could focus on the general, raise money, not have to campaign against another Democrat. So raise money and not spend it. And while Republicans were battling it out. Your point about the party apparatus, yeah, Republicans are factionalized. So are Democrats. I think we can't and shouldn't underestimate the tension that exists between the progressive wing of the party and the more middle of the road sort of establishment Democrats that are out there on the Republican side, right? You mentioned disarray. I think you could say that, but let's not forget where the Republican Party was just a year ago when they had Christina Caramo emerge as Republican State Party chair, or maybe that was 23, wasn't it? Whenever they had a point at time,
Yeah.
Christina Caramo was their state party chair, and it was a mess, right? It was an absolute mess in terms of fundraising, spending, and they were able to pull back from the abyss somewhat in choosing Pete Hoekstra to be their state party chair. We'll see what path Jim Runstead takes. Certainly a firebrand in many respects, somebody who's not afraid to make some waves and call it like he sees it. I think interesting times ahead also for both parties.
Well, you will certainly be busy during that 2026 campaign. You will be quite the media celebrity, I'm certain.
Always lots to talk
We
about.
look forward to hearing your views. Bill, I'll turn things over to you to close things with David?
Just to stick with the 2026 election a bit more, and you spoke earlier to the historic, clear trend that the off-year election where there isn't a president up is tough on the party that has a president in office. What what role do you see the popularity of President Trump playing in 2026 in Michigan's election?
There's a clear pattern that the lower the president's job approval, the deeper the losses for the candidates of the president's party. And most of the time, this is measured at the congressional level, and in particular, the U.S. House. The lower the approval, the more seats Republicans are likely to lose in the House. It's a little bit more muted in the Senate, but also see it here in Michigan at the state level, where and 2022 was similar, but maybe reversed, if that makes any sense, right? Because in 22, we had a Democratic president and a Democratic governor seeking reelection. Those were two sort of competing forces where Governor Whitmer was on track to be reelected because history tells us that Michigan often gives two terms to one party. But there was that question of, okay, it's a midterm year. That's why I say that there were candidate and issue effects there that really were smartly used by the Democrats. In 26, we've got the midterm that will make it more difficult for Republicans. But at the same time, usually Michigan changes parties for the governor's office after two cycles. Certainly in the era of term limits, we've not seen a third term for the same party. And you got to go back even further before you see John Engler is the exception when he won 3 terms. But beyond John Engler, it's even more election cycles before we see 3 in a row for one party. So again, we've got these competing forces that are going to be, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out and which one is stronger come November 26.
And the factors that might be center stage. You've talked about issues, maybe the ballot issues have certainly been powerful in Michigan as maybe just get out the vote measures, money. You talked about the party machinery, the traditional county party chairs and state party chairs, those kinds of people on getting out the vote. Are there any of those that you see as being especially important in 2026?
I think it's too early to all of them. I think that we might see 1 or 2 emerge depending on the others and how the cycle starts to play out.
Yeah, my sense is maybe the ID for voting. I think I can't believe that can help Benson. It might be a bit of a boost for Republicans. Some talk of some school choice, that kind of ballot initiative that might help Republicans. But yeah, I am convinced that I believe the recreational marijuana, I believe certainly abortion, redistricting. I think they moved in the tight state that you very clearly outlined. I think they could make a difference, and I don't see a runaway candidate on any of these.
And Bill, I think that's just another example of how, slight changes in turnout or turnout among certain groups can really have a big impact on the final outcome. It's not like those ballot initiatives needed to drive 50% more turnout from the state. It was maybe a little bit more turnout from folks who might otherwise have stayed home that year. And that's enough combined with the vote choice of those folks who are coming out, not only on the ballot initiative, but on the candidate choices to really have a sizable impact on the outcome.
Merrick, back to you.
I just want to say thank you for a fascinating interview, Professor. It's been very informative. And I'll ask if there are any concluding thoughts or statements you'd like to make.
Merrick and Bill, thanks for the invitation. Great to talk to you both. If depending on when this airs, I'll plug an event that we have coming up at the Center for Civic Engagement on OU's campus. We've got a former ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, who's going to be on campus for a talk on April 7th. So we've got about a month before that. And Taylor's a fascinating guy who is going to come and talk to us about the current state of the conflict there. He worked for presidents of both parties, worked for George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And I think the timing worked out very well for us to have former Ambassador Taylor. If anybody is looking to come to that, we've got limited space, but please feel free to come to oakland.edu/CCE and you'll be able to find a registration page.
If you have a flyer or something you can send me that I can post on this video after your
Absolutely.
we will advertise it. That would be great.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
And thank you again, Bill.
Look forward to, just frankly, I will be at that presentation. I helped start a business school in Ukraine while I was dean of the business school at Wayne State. I have a number of friends there that followed a very difficult time there very closely, and look forward to hearing from the ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the invitation.